Hi, and welcome to another in Chemsafety series of online webinars for 2021. My name is Chrissy and I'm the Consultant Coordinator here at Chemsafety. And today we're going to be discussing what training is required for people working with hazardous substances. Janet is our presenter today, and she is not only a compliance certifier, she is also a senior consultant and director of Chemsafety with over 18 years experience. As a recognised expert in her field of hazardous substance, Janet has been invited to speak and chair at numerous conferences and professional development sessions. If you're watching our training live, there is a Q&A tab at the bottom, and so you can post any questions and Janet will answer them at the end. Details will also be on a follow-up email, which will have a link to the recording of today's session and some online resources. So thanks for watching, and I'll now hand over to Janet.
That's great. Thanks so much for that, Chrissy. I'll get the screen up for you. That's great. So today we're going to be looking at the worker training requirements for hazardous substances, what training you need to be doing, and the records you need to keep. And the particular perspective I'm coming to this from is primarily as a compliance certifier, and what I need to see if I'm coming on site to have a look at your location, and reviewing your training records is part of that. But it's also looking at it from a more general perspective, and the records that you need to keep, or the training you need to do for the hazardous substance regulations. So you should come out of this with a better understanding of what you should be doing, and probably a better understanding of what you are currently doing. We could summarise this webinar in 10 seconds. You probably train your workers well, but you might not be able to demonstrate this with good records there. So we'll go and have a look at why we need to do training. And hopefully this is a rhetorical question. There are many reasons why you would want to train your workers, but primarily you want people to do the job right, and you want people to do the job safely. If I think back more years than I care to remember, at university, the focus was very much on what the chemicals would do to each other rather than what they could do to me and my colleagues. And that's a good demonstration of how things change over time. When I was at high school, I would have been one of the last years where we didn't have to wear safety glasses in the chemistry lab. And we did the archaic practice of mouth pipetting, which, if you can imagine sucking things up with a straw that isn't a nice fizzy drink, then that's what we were doing. Our processes get better and safer, but people won't change unless you train and teach and tell them. You probably have, because we have to, on the list of why we train, but that certainly shouldn't be the main driver of what we're doing it. We want people to do the job right and safely. We also need to be able to show that our staff have been trained. We'll assume that they have been to some extent or another. If something goes wrong from a quality, process, safety, or other perspective, you need to have the confidence that you've done all that you possibly could and that you can show this. You also need to have records to satisfy your own quality processes, and if WorkSafe or a compliance certifier comes on site, then you need to make training records relating to hazardous substances available to us. The training requirements in relation to hazardous substances come from a number of areas. Our main focus today is the Health and Safety at Work hazardous substance regulations. But under the Health and Safety at Work Act, the PCBU has a primary duty of care, which includes the provision of any information, training, instruction, or supervision that is necessary to protect all persons from risks to their health and safety arising from the work carried out as part of that business. So it's making sure that we're protecting everyone from risks to health and safety. So not just the workers, not just the other colleagues at work, but any members of the public around that may be impacted directly or indirectly by the work that you're doing. There are requirements under the General Risk and Workplace Management Regulations that workers carrying out work of any kind are adequately trained, and that includes training around the use of PPE, personal protective equipment, and emergency procedures. You will also have training requirements from your industry and to meet your quality standards as well. Regulation 4.5 is the regulation in the health and safety at work hazardous substances that specifically addresses the training and supervision requirements for workers handling hazardous substances. And this was one of the major changes when the regulations changed in 2017. So prior to this, HAZNO required that approved handlers were in place for a range of hazardous substances depending on the class and quantity. So over 100 kilograms of LPG, for example, used to need an approved handler. If you didn't have substances that met those class and quantity thresholds, then there were no specific requirements in the HAZNO regulations for training. There was the general training requirement for risk management under the Health and Safety and Employment Act, but nothing particular for hazardous substances. So when the regulations changed, the requirement for training for all workers handling hazardous substances was introduced, and that's this regulation 4.5, and the need for a certified handler, which has replaced approved handler, reduced to the most toxic substances and also some explosives. So we'll be looking at more detail now at what is required by this regulation 4.5. The requirement is that training is provided to workers who use, handle, manufacture or store hazardous substances. So we need to identify the relevant workers. All personnel at your site, including office workers, should have a basic understanding that hazardous substances are present in their workplace, what to do if they see something wrong, and where to stay out of if they haven't been trained. The scope of the training and information increases with the workers' involvement in the process in hazardous substances. There is unlikely to be a one-size-fits-all approach to the workers at your workplace. The training needs to be relevant to their roles. What substances, equipment, plant, PPE will they be using or handling or storing or manufacturing? The duties for training are that we need to provide information, training and instruction, and supervision and practical experience. We need to keep records, and we also need to ensure that there is some site-specific training. So I'm going to go through each of these aspects in a little bit of detail and talk about some of the types of training that could cover these. It is most unlikely that there is a single course or certificate that you can produce that says, here is my training record, I have trained my staff, just look at this one thing. There shouldn't really be a single course or element or document that covers everything. It's a very broad process. There's lots of information and types of things that need to be covered in the training. You should also keep in mind that individuals have varying learning styles and that the most effective instruction that you can do will take this into account. Most simply, we need to provide information of what hazardous substances are present and what operations involve those. So that might include identifying which workers are involved in those work areas, what your inventory or register of hazardous substances are, so you know which substances are present, and including a site plan or something similar that shows where your hazardous substances are. So this sort of thing might be covered in an induction, some basic SOP training, a site familiarisation of what's happening at your site. You also need to provide information about reference material, where it is, how you get access to it, that covers the hazards, safe handling and storage of hazardous substances. So this includes safety data sheets, but is not limited to safety data sheets. So it might also include your operating procedures, any manuals you'll have, any charts or reference guides that you have available. And so these might again be covered in induction information and emergency training, and as you start doing on-the-job training for people. Workers need to be aware of the chemical and health hazards associated with their hazardous substances, whether they're flammable, toxic, corrosive, oxidizing, etc. So this information will be shown in the classification of the substance. And as you may be aware, we have recently changed our classification system in New Zealand. So the new GHS classification system spells out what these hazards are very clearly. I've said before, I'll just mention it here in this webinar as well, the hazardous substance regulations haven't changed, and they will still refer to the hazard classifications like 3.1b, 6.1a, 6.7b, etc. But you will start to see more of the descriptive GHS classifications coming through. So a chemical awareness course is a great way to give that foundational information in what the physical and health hazards and properties of substances are. People need to have instruction in the procedures to safely use the hazardous substances that you've got on site. So some of this might come from actual qualifications. So if you've got a trade qualification relating to the use of your hazardous substances, then that will have included the general procedures for how to safely undertake that work. You might also have on-the-job training as well in competencies. It might be covered in the induction. This is how we do things at this site. So there's both the generic information or the qualification sort of information, how the job is done, and then also the extra layer of how it is done at this site. How to safely use the equipment and PPE that you have for using your substances. And there's also a requirement that workers understand what their obligations under the regulations are. And this is the area that we most frequently find gaps in when we're looking at training records for compliance. The worker obligations are quite straightforward. It's making sure that you are looking after your own health and safety and the health and safety of others, that you're following the appropriate instructions and procedures and rules set down by your employer, that you wear the PPE that you've been given, that you report damage to it, those sorts of things. And so that sort of thing is probably covered in health and safety training that you do. You might do it in a toolbox talk, but people often don't associate that training with their hazardous substance training records that they're providing to a certifier. People need to know what actions to take in an emergency. And this is an area where it will vary depending on the role. So in some cases, it might just be that the majority of people just need to evacuate and inform trained personnel who can actually respond. Once we've covered the knowledge side of things, we start looking into the practical sides of things. So we need to ensure that if people are not properly trained and experienced, that they're being supervised. So if you are thinking of a new worker coming to start a job on site, then they might go through a process of observing the task being undertaken. They might assist with the task. Then they will undertake that task supervised, and then they might undertake that task independently but being overseen, and then they can be assessed as competent. So that sort of process should form a part of the record. You should document how that has been done when you're looking at your worker training records and their competence and practical experience with particular tasks and substances and processes. You might want to consider whether a person is being trained in many aspects of the job at once, or whether they do this sort of process one task at a time, and that you're keeping records of this as it occurs. In the event that an accident happened and there was an investigation, you would want to be able to demonstrate that if someone was working independently, that you had recorded when they were competent, or if they were being supervised, that who that competent supervisor was. So there can be quite a bit involved in it. While we're talking about supervision, it's not limited to new workers. So you might also need to provide supervision to contractors or other workers who are coming to your site and might have to do work that exposes them to hazardous substances that they might not necessarily have experience with. So if someone's coming in to decommission some equipment or to undertake some repairs or maintenance, make sure that you are confident that not only are they qualified to do the work that they've come to do, but that they are aware of perhaps additional hazards that might come in place with hazardous substances. And so that sort of thing might be done through a job safety analysis, and that sort of thing, that you're looking at the process at the time that it occurs, rather than as a body of training that's sitting in not in the background as such, but is there supporting everything. If you are employing workers who have experience elsewhere, so they're new to your site, but they're experienced in their field, there is particular information that you'll need to keep records of as well. So anything that's site specific about the induction, where the substances are on your site, where the reference material is on your site, what your specific procedures are, you'll need to make sure that they'll have that training and that's recorded. And you also need to make sure that you've got good records, that you're satisfied that the person has the required training. So whether they can, provide you with evidence, do they have particular trade qualifications or other qualifications that they can provide to you? And that also comes into satisfying that they're competent to be able to do the work. So there's certainly provision for recognising people with experience in the field. They don't have to start from scratch, but we just need to make sure that we've got evidence that we are confident that they're competent. And then we also need to look at the ongoing competency of our people too. So the regulation requires that people are trained before they're allowed to carry out or supervise work involving hazardous substances. The regulation doesn't say for the first time. So if they are people who are carrying out work, you don't need to train them every week, but you do need to make sure that you have got something in mind about when training might need to be revised or refreshed, or whether you need to assess competency from time to time if there's been a near miss or an incident that has made you think that someone needs to have training, that you're recording that repeat or refresher training that you're doing. We want to do the training so that people do the job right and they do the job safely. And so we need to make sure that the training that we're doing sticks. If there's something new going on, we don't want people reverting to potential bad habits that they might have had in the past. I want to look now at the records side of things. And as Chrissy did say earlier, if there's any questions, I'll look at those all at the end. Having good records of your worker training not only enables you to easily demonstrate your compliance, but it also enables you to see the gaps that you might have to manage the renewals and refreshers and things for your workplace. So we're not just keeping records to keep WorkSafe happy, they're an integral part of how you run and manage your business there. There's no specific form that the records must take, and they can be paper or electronic. The people who will be asking to see your records will include the compliance certifier, if you're getting a location compliance certificate, or if you want someone to become a certified handler, we'll need to see records of this training under Regulation 4.5, and WorkSafe can also ask to see your records. And in the regulations themselves, they say that you must make them available to a compliance certifier or WorkSafe. So what I would love to see, if I'm coming on site to look at your training records as part of compliance work, I would like them to be easy to follow. Is there a single place I can look to identify the staff and the type of training? If there's a nice overview or a training matrix that lets me see that. Looking through a ring binder of 15 years of training records isn't easy to follow. It's not a good use of time and resources, and it must be very hard for you to manage yourselves on site. We also want to be easily able to see which training items or records cover which elements of the regulations, so that we can easily identify that you've covered everything that you need to do. Sometimes we see beautiful training records and it makes us so happy. So your training records should include who attended the training, when the training was and where if applicable, what the training covered, and that needs to be, in order to establish whether or not the elements required have been met, that what the course summary or syllabus sometimes needs to be quite detailed. We need to know who did the training. Are they competent to train? If you're doing training internally, then is the internal trainer competent in what they're covering? Or are they someone who is well experienced in training people? Would also be someone suitable for training there. Was there any assessment associated with the training or the course? Did they attend it or did they pass it? And what were those criteria if necessary? Does the course or qualification or training or competency have an expiry or refresher date? Is it a renewal that's required by law? For example, your driver's license or your certified handler certificate will have firm expiry dates and they need to be renewed after that period of time. Or is it that a refresher is recommended after a certain period, whether that's any internal training you do or training you do through training providers? And also making sure that you're including any other relevant information that occurs to you as you're keeping the record. Records can take a variety of form, including forms. So they might be a record of attendance, they might be SAP training and sign-off forms, checklists, certificates, those records of supervision that I talked about earlier, your records of competency assessment, or indeed it might be a recognition of prior learning assessment that you do, where you looking at bringing people with lots of experience into a new training record system. You don't necessarily want to make them attend all of the training or go through all the training again, but if you can do an assessment and a recognition of prior learning process, then that gives a good record from a point of view, a point in time that we know they're experienced, this is how we do it, and then going forward they will be included in any other training records that come along. And at some point, if you haven't been doing it now, then you should absolutely start having your training records in place and documenting what people already know. So I've got some examples of what records might look like, some of the things that we've seen coming through. So this is a very simple sign-off sheet that we have to cover that gap where I said that we often don't see the worker obligations coming through. So it's telling us what the course related to or what the session related to. This actually details what the material is, and then there's an acknowledgement of the people that they've either read or they attended the toolbox talk or brief session that covered these items. Do try and make sure that people write their name legibly. That's really important. This is an example of a training checklist for a particular substance, so related to LPG. The trainee goes through with a supervisor or other colleague who goes through and assesses that they can answer all these questions. If you've got a good series of standard operating procedures or SOPs, then having a sign-off section or a check sheet at the back where you can document that people have understood and assessed and demonstrated their competency in that procedure is a really useful way of keeping the records of competence with the particular procedure that they've been trained in there. And that could also include space on this record for the supervision process if it's a new trainee. This is an example of the chemical awareness course certificate that you'd get for the training that we do at Chemsafety. So it includes a clear description of the processes and the substances that are covered in the course, and we've got information on the back of it that outlines what the course covers and also what other training is needed. Because, as I said, there's not a one-stop shop for getting your training required for hazardous substances, and in particular the practical side of things, the use of equipment on site isn't something that can be done in a classroom situation. The summary, the matrix, seeing at a glance what training records you've got, that's really, really useful. And if you've got a smallish number of people, then a good spreadsheet matrix can be very, very effective. So in this one, we've got the people across the top there. We've got Bob and Kate and Paul and George and Ringo who work at this wonderful company. And we've got whether or not they have completed or are competent in the items that are down there, and when those training items are due for review. So we can see which ones people have done and not. We can look at the dates that are past or coming due and see easily that if we're needing someone with a DG endorsement, then we need to give Bob or Ringo a call. And I've got a whole lot of questions coming up towards the end as to what sort of questions you need to be able to answer from your training records. If you've got a larger organisation, then you might use other document management systems or specialised record keeping systems. So this is just an example of my own training records from here, and this is part of our document management system. So it allows us to access for a range of topics and courses that each worker has attended, whether they've completed or authorised in it, and when that was done. So I became a compliance certifier 14 years ago. That's good to see. My anniversary is coming up later this month from when I first became a compliance certifier. So there are many, many tools out there that you probably already have in your workplace that if you're not using them for training records, then might be able to be used to keep good track of your training records. Our document management system allows us to dig in deeper, to do filtering, to find all the records and certificates and things associated with these records. I mentioned earlier on that very rarely is there a single document or training that you can do in relation to hazardous substances, but there's one specific case where it is appropriate. And so if you've got a workplace, for example, that only has LPG as their hazardous substance on site, might be used for cooking or water cleaning, then, and the on-site personnel, they don't connect or disconnect the cylinders, that's what the gas supplier does. The people on site do need to have still had some relevant training relating to the hazardous substances and awareness of the hazards, what safe storage looks like and what to do if something's not right and what their obligations are. And so for places that have only got LPG that they're not handling the cylinders of, this is a great one-stop record of what was done. And so we've got the information and we've got the who's done the training, how it was done, and the records there. And that's something that is available on our website. So are your records usable? Can you identify these things? If you're looking at Bob, what training has Bob done? If you're looking to see who's done the induction module, I can see that everyone's done it, but there's a gap there. Who needs to refresh or redo their first aid training? Who's competent to undertake this particular procedure? And who's competent to train new workers? These are some of the questions that you need to be able to answer from your records if they're going to be effective. And you need to make sure that they're up to date, that you've got a good, sensible process for keeping those records. And that's something that I'm very aware of in myself. I'm very good at making complicated systems that people then have trouble using. So you need to make sure that something that you're doing is usable. I also want to look briefly at what's required for certified handlers. So as mentioned earlier, certified handlers are only required for a smaller group of substances now. And I usually just talk about toxic substances 6.1A and 6.1B, or in GHS speak, acutely toxic category 1 and category 2. There are also explosives and fumigants and substances that need a controlled substance license, usually vertebrate toxic agents, that also need certified handlers. But for the work that we specialise in, it's really around the toxic substances. You do need to be aware that there are some variations. And so one of the most common substances that would need a certified handler but doesn't is hydrochloric acid, spirits of salts. You can buy it at the hardware store. It's a class 1 6.1B acute inhalation toxicity category 2. So that would normally require a certified handler given its classification, but there is a safe work instrument that states that it doesn't need to have one. So it's the snazzily named additional and modified requirements for specified class 6 and 8 substances safe work instrument, but that's the one that says if you've got hydrochloric acid stronger than 25%, it doesn't need a certified handler. So there are a few exceptions like that just to be aware of. To become a certified handler, the candidate needs to demonstrate the hazard classifications, properties, and adverse effects. And these all relate to the hazardous substance that needs the certified handler, so they're highly toxic substance. They need to know all the requirements that are imposed on that substance by the hazardous substance regulations and also by the HAZNO Act, so that's the EPA notices as well. They need to know any conditions or limitations on their certificate. So you don't just get a blanket certificate that says now you can go and work safely with every hazardous substance. There'll be limitations on the substances and circumstances of use. The certified handler needs to know what the precautions to take are to prevent injury or illness, what procedures to adopt in an emergency, and as someone who has demonstrated a high level of knowledge and experience relating to these substances, then they should absolutely be someone who's hands-on helping in an emergency. They need to be aware of any variations to the requirements and the provisions of safe work instruments that relate to their substances, and they need to demonstrate working knowledge of procedures and plant. And then they also need to have evidence of the training and instruction required by Regulation 4.5. So when we're looking at certifying someone as a certified handler, we want to make sure that they've got the knowledge, that they've got the practical experience, but we also need to see the training records from the workplace that show that they've done all the other training records, the training that's required. Certified handlers are able to supervise people who are not certified handlers if they are working with substances that need one. The other variation relating to training in the regulations comes up for laboratories. So if you are operating a laboratory under Part 18 of the regulations, then there are specified skill and knowledge requirements for the laboratory manager, for people handling the hazardous substances, and also note that the laboratories don't need to have certified handlers. They need to make sure they've just got the knowledge requirements for those people handling and the laboratory manager. I want to briefly mention managing change. You probably all have some sort of process that you follow if you're managing changes in your workplace. And that could be a detailed MOC process that you go through and assess all the changes and the outcomes that could be, or it could just be that you have a bit of a think about what you're going to be changing. Make sure you're including the training requirements that will be impacted in cases of new staff or redeploying staff to a new area of the business, if you've got new or changed processes, if you're changing your hazardous substances or equipment, and if there's been any changes to the regulations. So there's been a big change in the last couple of weeks around the classification of hazardous substances. It doesn't have a big impact on the workplace use of the hazardous substances. People need to be aware of new terminology coming through. If you're an importer or manufacturer, then there's something a bit more to be done. But if it's workplace use of hazardous substances, nothing's really changing there yet. If you're looking for further resources, then WorkSafe do have some information, a quick guide on their website that includes a wee checklist. We have published a training checklist on our website, and we've also got that regulation sign-off form that I showed earlier available there. So there's a lot of questions here that you can go through to make sure that you're covering the training requirements. And as Chrissy said, this webinar will be available on our website when we've completed the session shortly, and you'll also find our previous webinars there and any future ones that we do too. So I'll just have a look now. I see some questions have come through, and if you've got any more, please do add them now to the Q&A or the chat there. Right. So one of the questions is, do records need to have signatures to prove that the specific person has gone through it? Or might it be enough with an electronic matrix that says which date a person has been trained and by who? So the records can be electronic. You would need to just think about how you can verify that the person has done it. So if you've got an electronic matrix with a summary of the date of who's been trained and by whom, is there anything else, any information behind that that you might keep as as a record, but that's not in the matrix? Have you got a electronic system that keeps track as to who's signed it? So whether you've got electronic signing authorities or something that shows a record as to who did it. It's about just having that confidence that it is done. And if you've got something that shows good history as to when the records were created and who's made changes to it, then that's a really good sign as well. So if the person who did the training was the person who made the changes, then that's traceable. But it is something that you would need to have a look at it from almost like putting an auditing hat on to say, how are you confident that's a true record? And then another question, how do you determine the assessment requirements? When is a simple checklist enough? And when do you need a questionnaire or similar? It is going to vary on the nature of what you're training there. So a simple checklist, certainly in a number of situations is great. That yes, tick, I've read this and signed it, or a short test. And a short test after a lot of training is really good at just making people perhaps pay attention at the start of the course, but also think about what they're doing. And it doesn't need to be a detailed questionnaire, but if there's 2 or 3 questions at the end of a toolbox talk or a small training thing, then absolutely that it helps reinforce the training and demonstrate that the person was engaged. If it's something like a practical competency, then there might need to be detailed or semi-detailed notes written by the assessor that they can use to verify that they saw the right things being done. So there's also the question under section 18 or part 18 for laboratories, what specialised knowledge is required and how do you prove it? There absolutely can be hundreds of substances on site, and do you need to have training for each specific substances and sign-off? So you don't need to have sign-offs for every single substance that you've got. There's the regulations in Part 18 do state what the technical knowledge is, and it can be for classes of substance. So I know how to manage flammable substances, and I know how to deal with corrosive substances in general. And then if there are particularly high hazard substances, then you might need to think about those harder. So if you're using hydrofluoric acid, for example, then there's an antidote that's used for first aid treatment. So making sure that you're aware of that and how you document those. So people with chemistry qualifications can be used proof of competency, although as I said, when I got my degree, the health and safety aspects of the chemicals weren't necessarily given the focus that they are now. So think about what experience they've had since they did their degree or that sort of thing there. Are there any other questions that people, let's scroll on down. What is an appropriate level of training for a wholesaler that receives, stores and dispatches hazardous substances, e.g. flammable gases, flammable liquids in small containers, things that are corrosive, but people aren't using them. So if someone is storing and distributing packages, then knowing how to store that safely, what segregation is required, and most important really in that situation is that they know what to do if there's a leak or something's dropped. So most of the time, if they're stored in the appropriate store with the segregation or their packaging remains intact, then there's not a great deal of risk. But knowing what to do if there is a leak or a spillage or an emergency of some sort, that's really what we start to look at if we're looking at people who are doing mainly storage of substances. And we've got a polytechnic with a chemistry classroom. Does that fall under a laboratory in relation to the certified handling requirements? So the laboratories under Part 18 do include teaching. but I can have a chat with you individually just about what's required there for your particular substances and how you need to meet for that laboratory thing. And I'm getting the idea that perhaps there'll be a bit of interest in a session relating to laboratories. So we can absolutely look at doing that as a specific session there. Okay then, well that's great. Thank you very much for your time today. As you'll be able to see this again on YouTube, but if you do have any questions about the records or the training that you need or anything in particular, just give us a call. We'll be absolutely happy to help. Cheers everyone.